It's Dina and Lisa Graves, and we're breaking down a new decision by the IRS. Yet again, kind of a startling decision under this Trump administration having to do with what religions can do, and specifically whether or not they can endorse political candidates and keep their nonprofit status. You're here on the Legal AF channel. If you have not subscribed, be sure to hit that free subscribe button now. So what happened was there is a group of churches, it's a national religious broadcasters, sued the IRS and said the Johnson Amendment, which basically limits churches from participating in political activities in order to keep their nonprofit exempt status. Yes, this amendment, Johnson, was named after the president, Lyndon Johnson. They said this violates our First Amendment rights. This violates our free speech rights. And so they sue the IRS in the Eastern District of Texas in federal court. Well, lo and behold, the IRS doesn't fight them. They decide to enter into a consent decree with the plaintiffs and ask the court, basically saying, Judge, we're agreeing with these plaintiffs, and please, issue an order that's consistent with our agreement, which is that churches can endorse political candidates as long as they are doing it just to their own congregation. Churches maybe can't take out an ad, let's say, on the TV, but they can endorse political candidates from their pulpit. This is something that has never been articulated in any kind of court of law or anything. It may have been their practice to look the other way, but certainly never been put now saying the new law is allowing these churches to do it. Lisa, you are the constitutional scholar here on Legal AF. Let's get into this. I mean, I don't know how many times I can be surprised by Trump, right? Or the IRS. Basically, the IRS is saying, is allowing these nonprofits to do things they're not supposed to do, and they will collect less taxes as a result of it, right? But, so they're kind of working against their own self-interest, but not surprising under Trump to give this pass to religions. But what do you think about this?
Well, that's exactly right, Dina. This is really an extraordinary and outrageous decision by the Trump administration. This rule, which is a statute that's been on the books since 1954 for about 71 years. This was an amendment passed by Congress, signed into law by a former president at the time, that made it a violation of IRS tax code for nonprofits to endorse political candidates. So this is a rule that's been on the books for decades now. It's also a rule that has been targeted by right-wing allies of Donald Trump, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, and other politicians who have bristled under the notion that churches can't do whatever they want, basically. But the fact is that churches are nonprofits, just like other nonprofits, and nonprofits that are 501c3 nonprofits where you can get a tax deduction for donating to them have been barred for decades from endorsing political candidates. They can educate the public about issues. They can talk about the values or morals that matter to them, but they've been barred from endorsing candidates. And as you point out, the IRS is trying to present this, or the administration is trying to present this, as if it's just sort of codifying in a settlement the practice of the IRS to not prosecute preachers. And it is true that the IRS has not done so, but that does not mean that it has before now, ever in decades, publicly endorsed the idea that preachers should be able to endorse political candidates, including candidates for president, from their pulpit to their congregations, whether they're a congregation of 10 or 10,000. And when you look at the situation in the United States in terms of the massive growth of the nonprofit sector, including the number of entities that describe themselves as churches, including some entities that, like the Family Research Council, that aren't churches but have just declared themselves to be churches, this has a potentially far-reaching effect. And I think it's one that the Trump administration thinks will favor it, will help it in the coming elections. But there's more to the story. But I want to kick it back to you to get your thoughts about, are you concerned about this ruling? And what are your concerns, Dina?
Yeah, I mean, those who've been watching Unprecedented, the Supreme Court show I do with Popok, we've seen the chipping of way, right? I mean, the court, first, the religion, First Amendment in terms of free exercise of religion, establishment religion, for sure, Roberts has really encroached on what we think should be the free exercise of religion. And that includes not practicing any religion. So it's consistent with what we've been seeing, like the Supreme Court go. But it's also not just a religious issue. It's also a campaign finance issue, right? Because to your point there about organizations kind of declaring themselves churches, right? I mean, what qualifies as a church? So you could theoretically have a situation where somebody sets themselves up as a nonprofit, has, quote, a preacher, preaches on TV, let's say, to thousands and thousands of people, and then all of a sudden can avoid taxes. So there was a reason, like, even if they had an unwritten policy of maybe not going to preachers, I think there was a pact, at least, that the churches that were 501c3s knew that if they were, let's say, if endorsing candidates on their website and on their communications and getting out there broadly, they were going to catch the attention of the IRS, right? If they were going to allude maybe to policies and not candidates, there may have been a dance going on, but at least it was like a dance. When they have now asked, and I said consent decree, but it's actually a consent judgment.
Yep.
Now that they have this in court really saying, we don't think not only that we are taking the option of not going after you because of whatever resources or whatever, but we cannot go after you under the law. That, I think, is going to really open up abuse on this issue. And frankly, do we really want in America, like, candidates going to churches in order to campaign? First of all, it's not just a protection, honestly, of the government. The separation of church and state also helps churches too. Countries where there is no separation, that often ends up corrupting churches just as much as churches end up corrupting government. Frankly, just a bad mix all around. But here you're going to have, in these election cycles, candidates going and giving their stump speeches, right, to churches and funneling, who knows what donations through specific churches. The abuse, not only for churches becoming more influential in all our elections, but really opening up yet another hole in our campaign finance law right around the time I think we're all realizing how much we need to get money out of our campaigns. So, definitely a bad ruling for democracy all around here.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The fact is that, in the American colonial experience before the Constitution was adopted, there were states that basically had official religions, and people were, in essence, required to pay taxes to support those official religions, which were then involved in governing those states. And the founding fathers, who had a number of brilliant ideas and some ideas that were flawed, obviously 3/5 counting in slavery of slaves, that was deeply, deeply morally flawed. But on the First Amendment, they had, I think, a real clarity about the importance of that separation of church and state, that the government could not establish religion, and that people need to have the ability to have free exercise of religion. And that system, that wall, has served us well, has served America well. And I think it also has really protected freedom of conscience of parishioners. And now you have this, you're going to have this emboldening of some of these preachers who really are very politically oriented, very partisan, using that pulpit to endorse political candidates, including candidates for president. But it's also the case that there's a whole system here that you allude to, Dina, that, has a lot of problems. So, for example, I mentioned Family Research Council, which was a 501c3 nonprofit that for years filed the required disclosures by the IRS as a nonprofit. That meant disclosing how much it pays its executives, how much it pays its top contractors, how much money it spends on travel. Churches, once an entity is declared a church, it no longer has to file that 990 form, which makes it into a black box in terms of the way money is spent. And so you have billions of dollars flowing through some of the churches in this country with no public accounting of how rich those politicians, those preachers who may be acting as politicians now, or political endorsers, are getting. There's no disclosure of whether they have a conflict of interest, whether they're getting money from side deals, or, a lot of them are getting money from merchandise for some of the really big mega churches. For something like Family Research Council, which was a nonprofit but has, members, does that mean, as you suggest, that any message that they send out to their email list now counts as messages to congregants supporting a political candidate? That's extremely troubling. I think it also is symbolic or endemic of what we're seeing from this Trump administration, where there are so many people who've been put in positions of power who don't have substantial experience in the fields in which they are now the heads of those agencies. And so for the IRS, Donald Trump chose a former state politician named Billy Long to be the head of the IRS. Billy Long was formerly an auctioneer. He has no experience actually enforcing IRS laws, and even called for the abolition of the IRS. I suppose it would not be surprising that the IRS, under his leadership, would embrace a position that Donald Trump has supported, and his sort of close allies in the policy agenda, like ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has been significantly targeting anti-abortion efforts, like trying to make abortion illegal, as it did through the Dobbs case, targeting gay rights, targeting gay marriage, and more, that groups that have been moving in alignment with Trump on these policy issues have also been at the forefront of attacking this federal law, this Johnson Amendment. And so you have this confluence of, a political agenda by this president, an IRS that has been weakened by this president and by DOGE. You have outside groups that have increased money at their disposal and power. You have churches that have been embroiling themselves in politics at the edges in some ways, but not actually going forward and endorsing candidates. And now you have this result. And so in some ways, it's predictable, but that doesn't mean it's good policy or it's right. I think it's a really bad policy for all the reasons you point out. And I think it also is on this continuum of some of the activity we've seen from churches. And I was just going to say one thing about that, which is this decision was condemned by the nonprofit, the independent sector, which is the group that basically a trade group for nonprofits across the country, that it supports having limits on political endorsement by nonprofit groups, in part because I think their reasoning is that if churches get involved in endorsing candidates, that could make them subject to some backlash, not just by their parishioners, but by politicians who do not like who they endorse. We've certainly seen that scenario play out. But the other thing I was going to say, Dina, is, and this is a little bit of an older story, but I feel like it's worth sharing. Back in 2004, I was doing election protection at polling places in Minnesota. And that was during the presidential election. And when I got to the polling place in the morning of election day that day, all the women, the older women who were the poll watchers, the people, not the poll watchers, but the actual election workers who were, checking people off other voting and giving them ballots, they were talking before the polls opened about how that weekend, each of them had gone to a special summit conference scheduled by the Catholic Church. They were all Catholics in that instance. And the Catholic Church in 2004 was saying to those women, which is worse, abortion or the war in Iraq? And they basically, the Catholic Church in Minnesota, through these summits, told its parishioners that abortion was worse. So it was basically trying to weigh in and endorse George W. Bush without saying so. We've seen that type of activity that's at the edge of an endorsement, but not expressed. But now we're going to see that next measure, not just trying to put its thumb on the scale against, parishioners who were concerned about the lies that the Bush administration told to get us into war in Iraq, but that now they're going to go that extra measure and endorse an actual political candidate. I just think it's really problematic for leaders of faith to be involved in that way.
Absolutely. It's bad all around. bad for democracy, bad for the government, bad for the churches. But we wanted to make sure we talked about this because there's so many Trump items, so many legal items. But this is really important, and it's going to be an issue that they are going to want to build on. Trump is going to want to go even further with this. And so it's important for us to all be on the same page, all be informed as we keep up with what seems to be never-ending bad news. But at the same token, we can't, close our eyes to this. Being informed is the first step to ever having real change. So thank you so much, Lisa, for breaking this down for me. Those of you who haven't subscribed already, free subscribe so we can give you all these important updates.
Thank you, Dina.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.